The sheriff stood in the doorway of a house that no longer smelled like anyone lived in it. Dust lay soft on the mantel where her sewing basket used to sit. He had buried his wife 11 months back, and he had stopped lighting more than one lamp. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, quiet as forgetting. The mercantile owner, Dovra, leaned on his counter and watched the sheriff count out coins. "A house wants tending, Hollis," he said. "Same as a man. You let either go cold long enough, you forget it was ever warm." Hollis only grunted and took his flour, but the old Norwegian's wife, wiping the window, added softly, "Min man always said it. What we think is worth nothing is only worth nothing because we stopped looking." Hollis carried the words home without knowing he was carrying them. Sheriff Hollis Bracken lived alone in a square-frame house at the edge of Kjeldsen, Minnesota, in the winter of 1888. The town was small and getting smaller, half its sod claims abandoned after 2 hard harvests, and the people who stayed had the look of folks who had decided to outlast something. Hollis kept the peace, which mostly meant breaking up arguments over fence lines and walking drunk farmers home from the one saloon. He was good at it because he no longer wanted anything for himself. And a man who wants nothing is hard to provoke. The house had been his wife's pride. She had hung curtains and grown geraniums on the sill and kept a kettle always near the boil. Now the geraniums were brown stalks, the curtains gray, and the kettle cold. Hollis ate standing up. He slept in the smaller room because the bedroom still held the shape of her on her side of the mattress. He worked long hours so the house would be dark when he reached it, and he would not have to see how empty it was. The trouble was the coming winter. Folks said it would be the worst in years, and Hollis knew that meant weeks shut indoors, snowed in with nothing but the silence and the dust and the geraniums he could not bring himself to throw out. The widow Pruitt, who cooked at the boarding house, told him plain that he was wasting away. "You need someone to keep that house through the cold," she said. "Not a wife. I know better than to say that. Just hands. Just somebody to keep the fire and the bread and the floors so you don't go strange living in a tomb." He resisted the idea the way he resisted most ideas now, by saying nothing and hoping it would pass. But the boarding house had taken in a newcomer off the late train, a young Norwegian woman traveling alone to a brother who, it turned out, had given up his claim and moved on west without leaving word. She had spent nearly her last dollar on the ticket. She had no people and no place, and the snow was already falling. And the widow Pruitt looked at Hollis over her coffee with an expression that said, "The Lord arranges these things, and a sensible man does not argue." Her name was Sigrid Halvorsen. She was 24, and she had come a very long way to nowhere. Hollis met her in the boarding house parlor. She sat very straight with her hands folded, a small carpet bag at her feet that held, he would learn, nearly everything she owned. Her English was careful and slow, each word set down like a stone she was sure of. "Mrs. Pruitt says you need a housekeeper until the spring," she said. "I keep house well. I cook, I clean, I mend. I do not ask much." He had meant to say no. He had the words ready. But she looked at him steadily, not pleading, only waiting, a woman with no brother and no claim, and a town full of strangers between her and the cold. And he thought of the dark house and the brown geraniums, and something in him that he believed had died 11 months ago turned over once in its sleep. "Until spring," he said. "That's all." He regretted it before he reached his own gate. He had let a stranger into the one place he had kept sealed, and now he would have to watch her move through the rooms his wife had loved, touching the things his wife had touched, and he did not think he could bear it. That first evening was nearly unbearable. He showed her the kitchen, the woodpile, the pump that froze if you didn't keep it dripping. He showed her the small room she would sleep in, off the kitchen, and she set her carpet bag inside it, without a word of complaint, though it was hardly bigger than a pantry. When she saw the brown geraniums on the sill, she stopped and looked at them a long moment. "Throw them out if you like," he said, more roughly than he meant. "They're dead." She touched a stalk gently. Not all the way, she said. There is still green down low. May I keep them? He shrugged and turned away so she would not see his face. That night he lay awake in the small bedroom, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person in the house, the soft tread, the rustle, the click of a latch. He had grown used to silence the way a man grows used to a stone in his boot, until the absence of it feels stranger than the pain. He told himself it was a mistake. He would pay her through the week and find her some other situation. The widow Pruitt could surely place her, and he would have his quiet back. But in the morning there was coffee. Not weak and bitter the way he made it, but strong and good, and a fire already going, and the kitchen warm. Sigrid stood at the stove turning flatbread on a griddle, and she set a plate before him without fuss, as though she had been doing it for years. You did not have to, he said. I am the housekeeper, she said simply. This is the house. I keep it. He ate every bite. He could not remember the last time he had sat down to eat, and he found himself, against all his intention, reluctant to leave for his rounds, lingering over the coffee, watching the steam rise in the cold morning light. He still meant to send her on. He told himself so all the way to the jailhouse. But the taste of the bread stayed with him, and the warmth of the kitchen, and he understood with some alarm that the house had been warm for the first time in nearly a year, and he had not even noticed himself stop shivering. By the end of the first week, he had stopped talking about sending her on. By the end of the second, he had stopped thinking it. The snow came down in earnest, drift upon drift, until the road to town was a memory, and the world narrowed to the square house and its two careful occupants. He surrendered to the arrangement the way a frozen man surrenders to a fire, with relief he was ashamed of. He gave her his wages and his keys and the run of the kitchen, and he told himself it was only practical, only sensible, only a way to get through the winter. He did not let himself name the thing that had begun very quietly to thaw. The geraniums became theirs without either of them deciding it. Sigrid moved them to the sunniest sill and watered them with the dregs of the kettle, and trimmed away the dead until only the low green remained. Hollis watched her do it from the doorway, evening after evening, his hat still in his hand. My mother kept these, Sigrid said one night, in Norway, through winters longer than this. She said a thing that is still a little alive can be brought all the way back if someone is willing to wait for it. Hollis looked at the small green shoots and said nothing, but he stayed in the room. The long shut-in winter, which Hollis had dreaded as a kind of slow burial, became instead the strangest and warmest stretch of his life, though he would not have admitted it to a living soul. It began with the house itself. Sigrid did not simply keep it, she resurrected it. She beat the gray out of the curtains and hung them clean, and the light came through differently after that, softer and more golden. She scrubbed the floors until the old pine showed its grain. She found his wife's sewing basket on the high shelf where he had hidden it and asked, with great care, whether she might use the needles and thread, and when he managed to nod, she mended every shirt he owned, including ones he had given up as rags. He came home to buttons that stayed buttoned and cuffs that did not fray and socks without holes, and he had not known how worn down he had let himself become until he stopped being worn down. She cooked like a woman conducting a quiet war against the cold. There was always something on the stove, always a smell when he came in, stamping snow from his boots, and the smells were new to him, foreign and wonderful. There was lefse, the soft flatbread she rolled paper-thin and cooked on the griddle and spread with butter. There was a porridge she called rummagroat, rich and warm, that sat in a man's belly like a kindness. There was dried cod she soaked and simmered until it was tender, and a sweet cardamom bread she braided and baked on Sundays, filling the whole house with a fragrance that made him stand still in the doorway with his eyes closed. You are surprised, she said, once watching him eat. I'm surprised a person can cook like this in a kitchen this poor, he said. The kitchen is not poor, she said. It has everything. It only needed someone to use it. They fell into a rhythm. He rose early and broke the ice on the water barrel and brought in wood, and she made the coffee and the breakfast. He went on his rounds, which in deep winter were short, and came home by mid-afternoon when the dark came down. The evenings were the thing he had feared most, all those silent hours, and the evenings turned out to be what he came to live for. She taught him to play a Norwegian card game whose rules she explained badly and laughed at when he lost. She taught him words in her language, pointing at things, correcting his clumsy mouth around the vowels until he got them near enough, and she clapped her hands. He taught her English in return, reading to her from the few books in the house, an almanac, a Bible, a dog-eared novel of his wife's, and she repeated the hard words after him, frowning, getting them, grinning when she did. He found himself talking. He, who had said nothing to anyone for the better part of a year, beyond what his work required, found himself telling her things across the kitchen table, while the wind threw snow against the glass. He told her about the town and its feuds. He told her about his work, the satisfaction of keeping a small piece in a small place. And once, late, with the fire low, he told her a little about his wife, the geraniums, the curtains, the kettle always near the boil, and Sigrid listened with her whole still attention, and did not rush to fill the quiet after. And somehow that was the greatest comfort of all. She told him things, too, about the long sea crossing and the seasickness and the gray endless water, about the brother who was supposed to be here and was not, and the cold drop in her stomach when the station master shook his head, about the farm in Norway, the steep green of it, the mountains, the way the light in summer never quite left the sky. "You miss it," he said. "I miss the people in it," she said. "The place I can find again anywhere, if there are people." The house, which had been a tomb, began to feel like a place where two people lived. He noticed small things, the way she hummed when she thought he was not listening, the way she set his cup just so, the handle turned toward his hand, the way the green crept up the geranium stalks, a little more each week, until one gray morning in January he came into the kitchen and stopped dead, because on the windowsill, against all the white death outside the glass, a single red bloom had opened. He stood and looked at it a long time. Then he went to work without a word, but he carried the red of it in his chest all day like a coal. After the first bloom, something eased in him that he had thought was permanently set, like a bone healed crooked. He began to come home earlier. He invented reasons. The cold was bad. The town was quiet. A man ought not linger needlessly at a cold jailhouse when there was warmth to be had. He did not examine the reasons too closely. He only knew that the walk home, which had once felt like a march toward a grave, now felt like the best part of the day. They expanded their small world. On the clear days when the wind died and the sun came hard and bright, off the snow they went out together. He showed her how to set a snare for rabbits, and she showed him she already knew, having grown up doing it, and they had a good laugh over his presumption. He hitched the sledge and took her along the river where the ice had frozen clear and black, and they stood and looked down through it at the slow, dark water moving beneath. And she slipped her gloved hand into the crook of his arm to keep her footing, and he did not move away. She wanted to learn to drive the sledge, so he taught her, standing close behind her with his hands over hers on the reins until she had the feel of it, and then she was off, laughing, the horse trotting and the snow flying up, and Hollis stood in the white field and watched her go, and felt his face doing something it had not done. In a long while he was smiling. He put his hand up and touched his own mouth as if to confirm it. Indoors, the work of winter became a shared thing rather than her labor and his absence. He learned to knead the bread dough when her arms tired. She learned the names of all his ledgers and helped him with his accounts, which he kept badly, and her figures were neat and quick. They mended harness together by lamplight, his big hands and her small ones working the leather. They argued, mildly and with enjoyment, about whether her flatbread or the Widow Pruitt's biscuits were the superior bread, and the argument became a long-running joke that needed only a look to revive. One blizzard kept them shut in 3 full days, the snow so thick they could not see the barn from the window. In another winter, such confinement would have driven Hollis half mad with the silence. Now the 3 days passed like a held breath, warm and close and easy. They played cards until they were sick of cards. She taught him a song in Norwegian, a slow one, and though he could not sing, he hummed the low part, and their two voices filled the little house. She told him the old stories her grandmother had told her, of trolls under bridges, and a girl who rode a great white bear, and he found himself leaning forward like a child to hear how they came out. On the third night of the blizzard, the lamp guttered low, and they sat in the dim, warm kitchen and did not light another, and the quiet between them was not the quiet of two strangers, but the quiet of two people who had run out of nothing to say and simply liked sitting in the same room. "You are different than when I came," Sigrid said softly. "How's that?" he said. "When I came, you looked like a man holding his breath. Now you breathe." He was quiet a while. "I'd stopped expecting to," he said. "Breathe. Properly. I figured that was fish for me." "It is not finished," she said. "You only put it down. A thing you put down, you can pick up again." He looked at her in the low light. This woman who had come across an ocean to a brother who wasn't there, who had been handed to him like a chore, and had instead handed his life back to him a piece at a time, and he felt the truth of what was happening settle over him plain and undeniable. He was not lonely anymore. He had not been lonely in weeks. The realization should have frightened him, and it did, a little, but mostly it filled him with a wild and unfamiliar gladness he hardly knew what to do with. The geraniums put out a second bloom and a third. The house smelled of cardamom and wood smoke and the clean, cold air she let in when she shook the rugs. The dust was gone from the mantel. He had moved back into the bedroom, the big one, weeks ago, and slept through the night, and had not noticed himself doing it until one morning he simply woke rested and understood that he had stopped grieving in his sleep. Spring was still far off. He had stopped wanting it to come. It was the widow Pruitt who said it out loud first, when the road cleared enough for Hollis to fetch supplies. She watched him load the sledge with a knowing eye, and remarked that he was looking very well indeed, better than she'd seen him since before his loss. And then, because she could not help herself, she added that the whole town had noticed, and that some of them were talking. "Talking," Hollis said. "About a young woman living under a widower's roof," the widow said, not unkindly. "It was charity in November. It's something else by February. Hollis, whether you like it or not, people will say what they say." He drove home with the supplies and the words both, and the words weighed more. The talk, once Hollis knew to listen for it, was everywhere. It was in the way conversation stopped a half-second when he entered the mercantile. It was in the careful, bright tone people used with him, the questions that were not quite questions. It was in the look the preacher gave him after Sunday service, a look full of concern that was its own kind of accusation. Hollis had spent his life keeping the peace, and he understood crowds, and he understood that a small town in a long winter has little to feed on but its own talk, and that the talk grows fat on whatever it is given. He had given it a young woman in his house. He had not thought in November what that would look like by February. He had only thought of the cold and the dust and the silence, and of her with nowhere to go. He found he did not much care what the town said about him. He had buried his wife in their full view, and grieved in their full view, and he owed them nothing more of himself. But he cared very much, and, to his own surprise, what they said about Sigrid. She had done nothing but good. She had come to him with empty hands and given him back his life. And now the same town that had handed her to him was prepared to think the worst of her for it. The leading voice, he soon learned, belonged to a man named Verl Stang, who held the note on half the failing claims in the county and ran the land office, and considered himself the moral spine of Kjeldsen by virtue of holding so many people's debts. Stang was a man who liked order, and a widowed sheriff and an unmarried foreign girl under one roof was disorder. and disorder in a town was bad for the value of the paper Stang held. He began to make remarks. He began to suggest, in the mild, reasonable voice of a man who is enjoying himself, that perhaps the sheriff's judgment had grown unreliable, that perhaps a peace officer ought to hold himself to a higher standard, that perhaps the town council ought to look into the matter when it next convened. It was the council that worried Hollis. Stang sat on it, and Stang had favors out to half the others, and that the council had the say over who wore the star. Hollis had never cared much for the star as a thing to keep, but he cared for the wage that came with it, and the wage was what kept the house, and the house was what kept Sigrid through the winter. And so, for the first time in a long while, Hollis found himself with something to lose. He did not tell her at first. He came home and ate her good bread and watched her tend the geraniums and could not bring himself to bring the town's ugliness into the one warm room left in his world. But she was not a woman who could be kept from seeing what was plain, and she had her own errands in town, and she came home one afternoon with her face very still. "The women at the well did not speak to me," she said, setting down her basket. "And the storekeeper's wife, who has always been kind, looked away. There is talk about me, about us." She said it without flinching, looking straight at him. "You knew." "I knew," he admitted. "You should have told me. I didn't want to bring it in here," he said. "This house. I wanted to keep it out of this house." Something in her softened, but her chin stayed up. "You cannot keep the cold out of a house by not speaking of the cold," she said. "It comes in the cracks. We must look at it together, or it will come between us." And he saw she was right, and he sat her down at the table, and he told her everything. Stang, the council, the note he held over the town, and the way he had set his mind to use the sheriff as an example. The threat to the star, and the wage, and the house. He told it all, and watched her face, and waited to see her decide that she had landed in worse trouble than she had. Fled. She did not decide that. She listened to all of it with her hands folded on the scrubbed table, and when he had finished, she was quiet a moment, and then she said the thing he had been most afraid of and least prepared for. "Then I should go," she said. "In the spring, as we agreed. Sooner, if it saves your place. I will not be the reason they take your work from you. I can find a situation in another town. I have found my feet before in a strange place. I will find them again." "No," he said too fast, and the force of it surprised them both. He had not known how much he had stopped imagining her gone until the words were in the room. "No, that's not." He stopped, struggling. He was not a man practiced at saying the things underneath the things. "I don't want you to go. What you want and what is wise are not always the same," she said gently. "You taught me that, with the geraniums. You said, throw them out. They are dead. You wanted to keep them, and you did not think it wise. And you were right to keep them," he said. "They bloomed. You showed me they could bloom." She had no answer to that, and her composure wavered for the first time, and he pressed on while he had the courage. But the trouble did not wait for them to settle it between themselves. Stang moved faster than Hollis expected. The next week brought a notice, posted at the mercantile and the land office and the church door, that the town council would convene to consider the conduct and fitness of the office of sheriff. And everyone in Kjeldsen knew what that meant and who had called for it. The meeting was set for the second Thursday in the schoolhouse, open to all, and Stang had arranged it so, Hollis understood, precisely so that the whole town could watch the sheriff be shamed and the girl be named, and so that the lesson would take. Worse, Stang did not stop at the council. He went quietly to work on Sigrid's, standing in the only other way available to a man who held everyone's debt. The boarding house where she might have gone, the families who might have taken her in for honest wages, the church relief that might have helped a stranded immigrant girl find a respectable place. All of these depended, one way or another, on Verley Stang's goodwill or his money. He let it be known in his mild, reasonable way that anyone who took in the sheriff's foreign girl would find him remembering it when their note came due. He was closing the doors around her one by one, so that her only choices would be to leave the county altogether or to stay and be the ruin of the man who had sheltered her. It was clever, and it was cruel, and it was entirely legal. And Hollis, who had spent his life enforcing the law, felt the bitter helplessness of a man watching the law be turned into a weapon by someone who could afford the better lawyer. The house grew quiet again, but it was a different quiet than the warm one. It was the quiet of two people, each carrying a fear they were trying to keep from the other. Sigrid still cooked, still tended the geraniums, but he caught her at the window, sometimes looking out at the white road as if measuring it, as if calculating how far her feet could carry her and to where. And Hollis lay awake again, not in the small room now, but in the big one, listening to the wind, turning it over and over, looking for the angle, the way out, the clever, quiet solution that the people who knew him swore he was good at finding. He could find nothing. Stang held the paper, the council, the doors. He held the town the way winter held the land, complete and cold and patient. And the second Thursday came on like weather a man can see across the prairie and cannot stop. And Hollis went to sleep the night before it with no plan at all, only the certain knowledge that tomorrow he would likely lose his work, and that losing the work meant losing the house, and that losing the house meant losing her. He woke before dawn to an empty house. He knew it the instant his eyes opened, the way he had known 11 months before that the other side of the bed was empty for good. There was no coffee smell, there was no fire. He went into the kitchen, and the stove was cold, and her carpet-bag was gone from the little room, and the bed in it was made up tight and bare. On the table, weighted under his own coffee cup with the handle turned toward where his hand would reach, was a note in her careful, slow, stone-by-stone hand. She had gone, it said, so that they could not use her against him. It was the wise thing. She thanked him for the winter. She did not sign it with love. He stood in the cold kitchen a long time holding the note. The house was a tomb again. He felt it close around him, exactly as it had before she came, the dust waiting to gather, the silence pooling in the corners, and he understood that he had not been cured of his grief that winter, so much as he had been carrying a second thing alongside it, a small bright thing, and now that thing was gone too, and the loss of it laid the old loss bare again, doubled. He had told himself all winter that it was only practical, a housekeeper until spring. He had let himself believe that lie because it was safer than the truth, and now the truth stood in the cold kitchen with him, and would not be argued with. He had not wanted a housekeeper. He had not been lonely for hands to keep his floors. He had been lonely for her, this exact woman, her humming and her stone-careful words, and her insistence that a thing a little alive could be brought all the way back. And she had been brought all the way back. He had watched it happen at his own table. She had bloomed like the red on the sill. She had gone to save his work. As if the work were the thing worth saving. As if the star and the wage and the good opinion of Verl Stang were worth one morning of her coffee, one card game, one slow song in a language he was only beginning to understand. His eyes went to the windowsill. The geraniums bloomed there, red against the white world, the way she had promised they would if someone was willing to wait. He set down the note. He was done waiting for the wrong things. He knew where she would go. There was one early train, the westbound, the same line her brother had vanished down, and it left the Kilson depot at 9. He looked at the clock. He had time, but not much, and the road was bad. But he did not go to the depot first. He went instead to the schoolhouse, where in 3 hours the council would convene to judge his fitness, and where Verl Stang expected to find a shamed and silent man. Hollis had spent the winter learning that the overlooked thing, the dismissed thing, was often the thing of greatest worth. He meant to teach the lesson back. He did 3 things before 9 o'clock, and he did them fast. First, he went to the land office, which opened at 8, and he did not go to threaten Stang, because a man cannot out-threaten the man who holds all the paper. He went to read the paper. Hollis had spent years as the keeper of records that nobody else troubled to keep, and he knew that the county filings, the deeds and the water rights and the survey marks were public, and that any man, including the sheriff, could ask to see them. He asked. The clerk, who feared Stang but feared the law a little more when the law was standing over him in a star, brought the ledgers. What Hollis found was this. Verley Stang, in the course of buying up the failing claims, had been quietly recording the boundaries a few rods generous to himself, swallowing slivers of the public road allowance and a corner of the schoolhouse section into the parcels he held. No single bite was large. Together they were theft, slow and patient and legal-looking, the same method Stang used on everything, and it was all there in Stang's own confident hand in the public record, because he had never imagined anyone would trouble to add up the inches. Hollis copied the figures into his notebook, neat as Sigrid had taught him to keep his accounts. Then he did the second thing. He went to the widow Pruitt and to old Dovry at the mercantile, and to three of the farmers whose notes Stang held, and he did not ask them to take his side against Stang, which they could not afford to do. He simply showed them the figures and the map, the corner of the school section that had become Stang's, the road allowance that had narrowed to Stang's fence, and he let them do their own adding. By 8:30, there were a dozen people walking toward the schoolhouse who had not meant to attend at all. The third thing he did was hardest. He went to the depot, where the westbound stood steaming, and he found Sigrid on the platform with her carpet bag, very straight, very still, her face set against the cold and against him. "You'll miss your meeting," she said. "Let it wait," he said. "I have something to say, and the train can hold while I say it." The conductor opened his mouth, and Hollis gave him the look he gave drunks and fence. Line arguers, and the conductor closed it. "You left to save my work. I don't want my work. I mean, I'll keep it if they let me. But it isn't the thing. The thing is, you came into a dead house, and you wouldn't throw out the dead flowers. And you were right, and they bloomed, and so did I. You said a thing a little alive can be brought all the way back if someone's willing to wait for it. I'm willing. I'm asking you to be the one I wait with. Not a housekeeper until spring, not Charity. I'm asking you to marry me and stay and let the whole town talk till it tires itself out." For a moment she only looked at him, and the steam blew between them, and he could not read her stone-still face at all. Then it broke, all at once, into the grin he had learned to live for over the long winter. "You took a very long time to say it," she said. "I'm slow," he said. "You taught me the words. I had to find them." She picked up her carpet bag. "Then I am not getting on this train," she said. "And you are going to be late to your meeting, and I am coming to watch." The schoolhouse was full to the walls. Stang sat at the front with the council, mild and pleased, a man who had arranged a hanging and come to enjoy it. He rose when Hollis entered and began, in his reasonable voice, to speak of standards and judgment, and the unfortunate matter of the young woman, and he was just warming to it when Hollis set his notebook on the table and asked the council, very politely, whether before they judged his fitness, they might first settle a question of the county records. Stang's voice slowed. Hollis read out the figures. The corner of the school section, the road allowance, the slivers and rods that had migrated, one filing at a time, into the parcels of the man who held everyone's debt and had appointed himself the town's conscience. He laid the map open. He invited any man present to walk out and pace the school boundary against the fence and see for himself, and old Dovray said he had already done it that morning, and the fence stood a full 8 rods inside where the deed said it should. The room turned. Hollis had kept the peace long enough to feel it happen, the slow swing of a crowd's weight from one side to the other. The people who had come to watch a sheriff shamed found instead that the man who held their notes had been quietly stealing the ground from under their school and their road, and a debt owed to a thief feels very different than a debt owed to a pillar. Voices rose. Stang stood and reddened and reached for his reasonable tone and could not find it. It did not end in ruin for Stang. because Hollis had learned that winter that the best resolutions are not the ones that destroy. When the noise had peaked, Hollis raised his hand for quiet and made Stang a plain offer in front of them all. Restore the boundaries, return the school section and the road. Forgive 1 year's interest on the failing claims as good faith. Do that, and the matter of the records would go to correction and not to the county court, where the word for what Stang had done was not a kind one. Stang, who valued his standing above his slivers and could count the faces turned against him, took the offer because the alternative was worse, and the town got back its road and its school corner, and a year's grace on its debts, and Verley Stang got to remain a man they merely disliked instead of a man they ruined. And the question of the sheriff's fitness, when the council finally remembered it, was carried in his favor by a show of hands so lopsided that Stang did not bother to vote. Hollis walked out into the white noon with Sigrid's hand in the crook of his arm. "You did not destroy him," she said. "You could have. You taught me that too," he said. "The overlooked thing's worth more whole than broken." They were married before the spring thaw, in the warm front room of the square frame house, with the widow Pruitt and old Dove, and half the reconciled town crowded in among the furniture. There was leffs and cardamom, bread and coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. The house no longer smelled like a place nobody lived. It smelled of wood smoke and baking and the clean, cold air she let in each morning. One lamp had become every lamp. The rooms were bright. On the sunniest sill, where dust had once lain soft over a sewing basket, the geraniums had grown into a thick red bank of bloom, more flowers than the pot should rightly hold. Leaning toward the light, brought all the way back by someone who had been willing to wait.